Welcome to Audit Bites, the podcast that helps auditors become awesome. Join us for bite-sized info and education to excel in your auditing career.
All right. That's embarrassing when that happens, right? You come on to your live stream and your mic is not working. I have a lot of settings here, and sometimes the settings get all messed up. So let's take it to the top from the top. Sorry, my friends. Look, internal auditors love talking about controls. But let me ask you this. What happens when the real risk isn't the control environment, but it is the culture? Because when the culture goes toxic, no checklist in the world will save you. So let's talk about why auditors ignore culture and the impact that it will have on your organization. So welcome to this episode of Audit Bites, especially now that we actually have the sound working right. This is episode number 77. And we're going to talk about why auditors ignore culture. And if this is your first time here, this is Audit Bites, episode number 77, the podcast where we talk about things that auditors only whisper out loud, only whisper at happy hour, but are afraid to say out loud. So today we're going to talk about the cost of ignoring toxic cultures. That's one thing. And then why we miss culture over and over and over again. And most importantly, how we can actually audit culture before it destroys everything. But before we dive in, I want to give a special shout out to my friend, Pete Havel. You see, Pete has a really good book. It's called The Arsonist in the Office. And it's talking about that one toxic person that can burn down your organization. I suggest you read that book. Pete and I have been talking lately, and he actually had a post on LinkedIn that sparked this conversation. You go back, you'll see that there are a few past episodes about culture, but I thought it's time to address it again because here's one thing that I've noticed. I've been in this profession for quite some time, and I've always embedded culture into my audits, and I thought that everyone else did until I realized that they didn't. So, what would an episode of Audit Bites be without a story, without story time? So, here we go. Imagine you open up the newspaper or your internet browser nowadays, and you see your company splashed across the headlines. Well, that's exactly what happened to Citigroup recently. Citibank, their wealth management chief, Andy Saig, allegedly berated an exec so badly that the man cried in front of colleagues. Don't believe me? There is the headline from Newsweek, which is, well, one extremely reputable magazine source, right? So I'm not here to litigate the facts. I'm here to discuss the facts as presented thus far. So let's play this out. Imagine you are Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citi, and something like this headline comes out. Do you side with one executive that you just brought into the organization, or do you consider the signal that you might be sending to hundreds of thousands of employees. Because here's what my buddy Pete said about this when he posted about it. He said, when you side with the jerk in the office, again, not saying that he is one, but this is representative of someone that could be one, right? But if the allegations are true, you are sending a message. You're sending a message that one person's power matters more than everyone else's trust. Let me say that again for those who didn't get it. You're signaling to the organization that one person's power matters more than everyone else's trust. And my friends, that is a culture audit failure waiting to happen. Now, with that said, are you all familiar with this particular story? You've been following it? What do you think about it? Because you know what? Before we even go further into this episode, let's just really talk about the story a little bit more, just in case there's some people who've not seen it nor heard of it. Let's just pull it up and read what some of the headlines are saying. So, if you look here, the story says top Citigroup banker Andy Saig allegedly humiliated employees with explosive tirades, made one executive cry. Let's go a little further. Citigroup star wealth chief Andy Saig being probed after 6 managing directors accuse him of humiliating employees with explosive tirades, including one outburst that reduced an executive to tears, according to a report. The New York-based mega bank hired white shoe law firm Paul Weiss to investigate CEO Jane Frazier's prized recruit following allegations that he mocked and undermined one of Citigroup's most prominent female executives before she left the firm. Saig, 58, whom Frazier personally courted at his Connecticut home to poach from Bank of America's Merrill Lynch division, allegedly unleashed expletive-filled rants and called employees' work pathetic in front of their peers, sources told Bloomberg. Let's go a little further. Some of the people also described a male managing director being reduced to tears after Saig berated him in front of colleagues while striking a tabletop. Oh boy. At the center of the complaints was Saig's treatment of Ida Liu, 49, who ran Citigroup's private bank for 18 years before abruptly leaving in January. Liu once held the same position Frazier occupied on her climb to CEO, making her departure particularly significant. Witnesses told investigators that Saig openly mocked Liu in meetings, undermined her authority, and made disparaging comments both to her face and behind her back. His chief operating officer, I won't even try to pronounce that name, but allegedly ordered another managing director to cut Liu out of critical business correspondence. That this is what one executive told Bloomberg News. After Liu's exit, Saig eliminated her position entirely and replaced her with 4 male regional co-heads reporting directly to him. Now, this is insane, right? So let's talk about a few things. Okay. First of all, let's just look truthfully at what happened. We hired in a new executive here, and maybe he didn't like some of the people's performance, and maybe he just wanted to get rid of them. That is okay if you find that people are underperforming. Most states in the US are what we call at-will states. You can fire someone at any point in time. But instead of doing that, what most people do is they try to make the job so unbearable for you that you will quit. And that is toxic behavior. That is what is unacceptable. Now, again, having a difference of opinion or not wanting someone on your team because you don't like them, that's purely okay. You can get rid of someone for personality conflicts and differences, but to berate people, to hit objects, to curse at people in the workplace, why would I stick around if I see a company treat other employees like that? Because if I do one thing to fall out of favor, you're going to treat me like that next. And that toxicity cost the company a lot. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the cost, right? Because culture costs. And no, I'm not talking about legal fees because in the story we just presented, they had to hire an outside attorney to come in and investigate. I'm not even talking about the PR cleanup because now they're going to have to do some PR cleanup. We know that that's a cost, but let's talk about this one Harvard study. So I was reading this study the other day, and this study suggested more broadly that bad workers may have a stronger impact on the organization than good workers. In many fields, including finance and accounting, researchers found that negative things have a stronger impact than positive things. So, in other words, if you have some rock star employees that are doing really, really well, those few toxic employees that you have will actually have a bigger impact on the organization than the rock star employees. Now let that sink in for a minute. I mean, really let that sink in. Your toxic employees have a more detrimental effect on your organization than your superstar employees. Think about the Wells Fargo scandal that happened a few years ago. On paper, their internal controls worked. The managers checked the sales reports to make sure that people were hitting their targets. But behind the scenes, it was a toxic environment fueled with, well, organizational goals and objectives that were so unrealistic that people began to commit fraud in order to meet those organizational goals and objectives. But from a control standpoint, a lot of things ticked and tied. So, bad culture will cost you. There's a consequence to having bad culture. Let's talk about the consequences. First of all, this is according to this Harvard study and several other studies. Productivity is going to tank. People don't want to work in a toxic environment. Sometimes you can't work in a toxic environment. Let me just throw some other stats out there for you. You do know that we live in a world where they say that we have the highest amount of prescription drugs for depression and anxiety than we've ever seen in our history. Now, some of that may be because, well, there are newer drugs on the market and we have better record keeping. I will admit some of that. But think about it. You have the highest amounts of people on medication for depression and anxiety. And a lot of that has to stem from their work life because you spend a majority of your day at work. So, do you think that people who are overly medicated or who have anxiety or who are depressed are doing their best work when they're in the office? Of course not. So, productivity is going to tank when you allow toxic environments. The next thing that's going to happen is your reputation is going to get torched. You see, even if this story I just showed you is not true, it is all over the news right now. And then the last thing is leaders who back toxicity risk undermining themselves. And you might ride high for a few years, but as soon as the true story comes out and you weren't on the right side of history, people will find out. But worst of all, once that trust is broken, once it's gone, you'll never get it back fully. You might be able to regain some of it, but it'll never fully 100% come back. You see, culture failures cost more than fraud because the thing is, they erode the human engine of your business. Culture failures cost more than fraud because they erode the human engine of your business. So that begs the question, why in the world do auditors miss culture? I mean, think about this. If we know that it's a huge risk to organizations, why do we play around and say we're going to audit culture once a year? Why do we not embed it into every audit that we do? Why do we miss those cultural signals that are within our organization? I think the answer is kind of simple. I think it's multifaceted, but still yet simple. The real simple thing is some of us kind of like numbers. And beyond that, we like things that we can test, tick, and tie. And culture is supposedly one of those things that you can't test, tick, and tie because it's messy. I mean, it's really not, but that's the excuse we use. That's the lie we tell ourselves and our stakeholders. Even psychology explains it. Many of you have heard about Kahneman's and his cognitive load theory. What happens is our brains default to the easy stuff when we're overloaded. And if you think about our jobs, we have to know a little bit about a lot of different things. We have to understand the numbers. We have to understand people and processes. We have to understand technology. We have to look for fraud, red flags. That can be overwhelming. And when life becomes overwhelming, we default to the simple stuff, to the easy stuff, ticking and tying controls. Not to mention, we had Sarbanes-Oxley come in years ago, which told us that financial controls are the only thing that matter in our organization. And so we've been living that life for so long that we just forgot about culture. A recent study I saw showed that audit departments that are responsible for SOX spend upwards of 50 to 60% of their time doing Sarbanes-Oxley. That's just one risk. That's financial risk. What about operational? What about cultural? What about technology? But here's the thing. The things that we look at that are measurable, those things that we really like to look at because it satisfies our right brain thinking. Just because it's measurable doesn't mean that it's always meaningful. I've seen audit teams document a control flawlessly while completely missing the fact that every single employee hated that control. They also worked around that control and they rolled their eyes every time they had to talk about that control. That, my friends, is not success. That is a failure. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I had one client. We were doing some Sarbanes-Oxley work. Ugh. And in doing that SOX work, they had one control that literally took them hours to simply execute. Everyone hated it. Everyone hated it. It was a quarterly control. People would stay late every night and on weekends every time it came to that time of the quarter to do that control. Now, the control was terribly designed, but it still worked. So it passed all the Sarbanes-Oxley tests. And all they needed was a little bit of money added to their budget to purchase a component for their ERP system that would have automated that control. But their supervisor didn't want to get the budget authority for that. Now, in the meantime, people were quitting because this and other things in the environment, but this was a signal, right? Because this and other processes were so daunting because everyone looked at the control past, but no one looked at the underlying culture that was crappy. So we miss culture as auditors because it's hard, because it's fuzzy, because it's not always so tangible. But again, don't confuse measurable with meaningful. Now, granted, you want to be able to measure things, but there are certain things that you can't measure that have meaning too. The messy conversations often reveal the real risk. But here's the second thing I want to talk about. Culture doesn't just create new risk, it magnifies old ones. And to that extent, culture is a risk multiplier. Take Enron, for example. You guys remember Enron? They had controls on paper, lots of them, tons of them. But their culture bred fear. It also bred competition that was so intense that fraud became survival. That was one toxic incentive structure that turned normal risk into existential threats. Now, here's what my buddy Pete said about this. Remember, I told you earlier, a lot of this was inspired by my buddy Pete. Because we talk about culture a lot. And if you hadn't read his book, The Arsonist in the Office, you got to go pick it up. But with this one, he said once employees know leadership will protect toxicity, they just shut down. They stop telling you the truth. And when I say you, I mean you as the auditor, you as the manager in the organization, you as the CEO, the CFO. They stop giving real feedback. And suddenly, leadership is flying blind. I worked at one organization, um, and I had a role where I was responsible for investigating things. And I remember it was really odd because when I started, I'd received more whistleblower tips than I had ever received at any job. And when I asked people, was that normal? They said no, that level of activity was not normal. Here's what was happening. They saw a new guy in town and they thought maybe the new guy would actually do something. Now, in one instance, we found that someone who was friends with with an executive vice president in the organization was stealing, was committing fraud. They had clearly done something wrong. The evidence showed it. My team compiled all the documentation and information. We gave it to the executive team. The executive team, what do you think they decided to do? Because the right approach when someone is stealing is to fire them, right? They don't deserve to work in that organization anymore. So I asked, well, what's going to be the consequence of this person's actions? They told me that they were going to allow the person to retire because they wanted the person to leave with some dignity. And I'm like, well, they stole from the organization. And I don't mean a small amount, it was over $1 million. I told the management team, if you allow this person to quote unquote retire with some dignity, you are going to send shockwaves through the organization. The culture is going to be restricted and inhibited. People aren't going to trust you because they're going to see that favoritism is what runs rampant here. I don't think that is the message you want to send. Now, that was my job to say that. They didn't listen. He was allowed to retire, quote unquote, with dignity. After that, activity to the whistleblower hotline began to slow just a little bit because people told me, and these were direct quotes from people. I had one person tell me they weren't sure which side I was on. And I'm like, well, I'm only on the side of truth. My job as an auditor is to obtain facts and then present the story that the facts give us. But if we don't talk about the cultural aspect with the management team and organizations, controls become lax. Trust is loss. So culture doesn't necessarily create new risk. It exacerbates old ones. So again, to that extent, culture multiplies risk. It's not just background noise. Now let's talk about some culture components, some things that we as auditors need to look out for within the culture of an organization, because these give us warning signs or confirmations if they're good. I've got 8 things for you. Let's talk about those. So, when you have unrealistic goals and deadlines, that speaks to the culture that management has set up. Remember Wells Fargo? We talked about that earlier. They had an incentive structure that was really unreasonable. And so, let me just fill in a little bit of the details here. Let me just fill in a little bit of the details here. The CEO at Wells Fargo was well known for saying 8 is great, meaning every customer of the bank needed to have 8 different services that the bank provided. Now, I want you to think about this. All of you have bank accounts. How many of you have 8 different services from one bank? So that would be like what? A checking account, a savings account, a money market account, a CD, a home loan, an auto loan. I'm at 6 now, and I can't think. Maybe insurance, some kind of insurance, maybe. So that's 7 things. How many of you have all of that bundled with one bank? And if that is their goal and objective is to get a majority of their customers on 8 different products or services, yeah, I think people are probably going to do some bad things to try and hit that deadline. So, as an auditor, when you go in to audit a department, do you look at their goals and objectives? Do you look at them and say, well, how are you guys going to actually meet this? Do you ask the staff, are they stressed trying to meet some of the current goals and objectives? By the way, let's further that question. Do you ask the staff, do they feel like they have the adequate resources to achieve said goals and objectives? Because if you have a goal and an objective that someone has made it impossible for you to reach, that possibly lends to a bad culture, don't you think? So wouldn't it be great if we kind of embedded that into some of the audits that we do? So the next thing is budget decisions. Does the money go where the values of the organization say it should? I worked for one organization and I had one audit client that would well, she would always cry, complain, and moan that her budget is not enough to get the job done. And I'm sitting here like, I'm not sure if you really have a complaint here. Um, but what is your complaint? And she would say, well, she had three people working for her and they could not get the job done. Um, they worked tirelessly, overtime, nights, weekends. And I said, well, what do you need in order to get the job done? She had identified a system that they could buy that only an add-on to a system that only cost like $15,000, $20,000. That's about it. Now, upon getting that system add-on, she could have eliminated two positions within their department. So instead of a department of three, she would have been a department of one. But her boss would not allocate that money. Now, part of this was her problem because the way she explained it to her boss, because quite frankly, eliminating those two positions and buying the system would have actually reduced her budget. But what she would have needed initially was money to buy the system, to kind of get it up and running. So it would have been an increase in budget and then eventually a decrease. And she didn't explain that well to her boss. But her boss just said no every time she asked without even inquiring. And so she felt like she was having to do a job with an impossible goal and deadline, point one, but it was because of an impossible budget authority because she needed a little bit more money. So we talked about it, got her to present her case to her boss in a better way. So we helped her put together some numbers to show the real impact. And she eventually got what she was looking for. But in the meantime, she and her boss kind of ruined the internal reputation of that department because everybody thought it was toxic. They thought it was a department where you had to work long hours because that's what everyone was doing. So even inadvertently, you could have a toxic culture that festers, one, because of unrealistic goals and deadlines, two, because of budget decisions. So now, it's a good point. When we talk about company culture, this is a comment for those listening and not watching. This is a comment from the audience. When we talk about the company culture, the auditors might face a low corporate environment in some companies who act much local and traditional way. So lack of professional perspective also creates unrealistic expectations and targets. Okay, so now if I get what you're saying here, because when I read it the first time, this is what I think you're saying. You might have a corporate headquarters, but then you might have a local division that may act differently because it may act like the local culture. And the local culture may be different from the corporate headquarters culture. If that's what you're saying, let me know. Just give me a yes. If it's not, then you can help me go to the right direction. That's what I think you're saying. You're saying, hey, you have different subcultures within an organization. Absolutely, you do. But that still doesn't negate what I said, right? You still have to look at those subcultures for what they are. And here's what counts at the end of the day. Is that subculture helping or is it hurting? It's okay to have subcultures in your organization. We've been taught that everyone should behave like the corporate headquarters. No, corporate headquarters sets the foundation, the values, the foundation. But if the values are still represented at that subculture level, you know, I've worked in organizations where at the corporate headquarters they wore suit and ties, but at some of the divisions, they were allowed to wear slacks because the culture was different. But the overall values of truth and honesty still held true, whether corporate or local. So, yeah, what you're saying is a really good point, but it still matters, right? That gets back to the values within the organization. Okay, so my third point, though, culture components that we have to look at as auditors are the performance measurements. What are you being measured against every time we audit a process? We should ask, how do you measure the performance of this process? If the performance measurements are unreasonable, like the goals and the deadlines, then that may urge people to create shortcuts. I worked for one organization where they had a tight deadline. They wanted to close the books within 7 days after the month ended. And they hit it. They were really good. It was a very efficient process. However, for a couple of months, they actually plugged the numbers. That's not a good thing, right? They just wanted to get the books closed and they figured they'd find the discrepancy later. One of their performance measurements was closing the books a majority of the months out of the year within that 7-day window. What are the performance measurements within the organization, and do they contribute to a positive culture or to a negative culture? Now, this next one, exit interviews and turnover. Most companies don't do exit interviews. Most companies don't care what you think when you leave. But here's the thing, that's where the gold is. That's what you find out. That's where you find out what people really think. That's where you find out the true heartbeat of the organization. And if you're not asking those questions, then you're not getting the information that helps you understand your culture. People leave organizations for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's money. Most times, studies show that it's because of a bad work environment. So if people are leaving because they think the work environment is bad, wouldn't you want to know what exactly do they think is bad about the environment? Because they could be right or they could be wrong. It's not always the organization, right? Sometimes it's them. Sometimes it's just not a match. Lately, I've seen people leave organizations who have asked them to come back into work after working from home for years. That doesn't make the organization bad, but wouldn't you want to know that that's why a lot of people are leaving? Because maybe you need to reevaluate your culture and actually allow remote work to continue, or maybe not. But if you aren't even asking the question, you have no idea. So now the fifth culture component is a very important one. And it's one that you need to look at as auditors. And it's hotline data. The whistleblower hotline data in your organization matters. I worked for one organization where I was in charge of the whistleblower hotline. And when I got there, I noticed something very interesting. We had absolutely zero activity, none. Now, this place had a very good management team. It was the best place I'd ever worked. I have to admit that. But I went to the executives and I said, look, we have no activity on the whistleblower hotline. And they said, that's great. And I said, well, not really. Because that could be for a variety of reasons. And there's certain things that we could be missing out on. One of the reasons there was very little activity is that people had no idea that it existed. So we put together a marketing campaign to get the word out. Now, activity did pick up. And some of the first things that came through the hotline, I love the way the management team actually reacted to them. We were allowed unfettered access to everything. And they took the things that we gave them very seriously. So what ended up happening was whenever things were reported, they really were serious items. They were legitimate items because people trusted the process. They trusted the management team. They trusted me and my team's ability to investigate and be fair and impartial. But hotline data tells a story. I worked for another organization where we got a ton of information and people did not trust the management team. They would ask to meet me off site because they didn't want to be seen talking to me. They would give me thumb drives full of information. We investigated and things were definitely bad there. But your hotline data tells you what the heartbeat of your organization is. So have you ever looked at it? Especially if you're not in charge of doing the actual investigations. A lot of audit departments are not. If you are not, you should be talking to those people because your hotline data tells you the heartbeat of your organization. The other thing you want to look for is leadership inconsistency or leadership consistency, either way, right? I told you all a story a few minutes ago about how in one role we investigated something. We found that this one individual who was friends with an executive in the organization caused a $1 million loss to the organization, and he was allowed to retire. Now, in that very same organization, we had looked at something else, and this person did not directly steal anything. He was just a bad manager. And so the controls over his area were fairly weak, and people were allowed to take inventory, steal inventory. And when we disclosed this information to the management team, they fired this individual. Total dollar loss was, I don't know, probably less than $50,000. And mind you, he didn't directly steal anything. So why was he fired and the other person allowed to retire? Now, after this happened, people kept coming to us in our office saying, that's not fair. So people understood and recognized leadership consistency, or in this case, inconsistency within the organization. It breeds a bad culture because people wonder, how will I be treated if something happens? Now, this works the opposite way. What if you do something really, really good? Take a tale of two people. They meet their sales goals and deadlines. One person gets a bonus, the second person gets a bonus, but then the favorite person gets a special incentive bonus on top of the regular bonus. Not necessarily because they did better than the other person, but because they were a favorite. Leadership consistency or inconsistency will help you determine what the culture in your organization is really like. Now, that leads us to the next point: promotion patterns. How are people promoted? Who is the person that is promoted? I worked at one job that made me very uncomfortable. Um, I was really good in my role there. And I remember after joining, my boss called me into his office and I thought I was in trouble. I was like, oh boy, did I do something? Oh, sat down and he said, let's talk for a minute. And here I am shaking in my boots. Would you be shaking in your boots if your boss called you into his office and said, let's talk for a minute? So I was shaking in my boots. I'm thinking, I'm about to get fired. And I was young at this time, right? Young. And I was like, just starting my career. I had just bought a house. I was in my early 20s. I was like, I just bought a house. I'm about to get fired. And he said, let's talk for a minute. And I was like, okay. And he said, I like the work that you do here. Oh, this is great. I'm going to give you a raise. Oh, this is even better. So he gave me a raise. And I was happy, like really happy. Um, and, so I went back out into the office, started doing my work. A few months passed, and he hires someone into the office that had zero experience, but he was a very personable gentleman. He was very likable, and that counts for a lot, right? Um, He was likable inside the office of auditing. Let's say that much. But he was there, and after about 6 months, he received a promotion. Now, quite frankly, I didn't really care because I knew how much he made, and I was making just as much as him. I just didn't have the title. But in the office, things got a little interesting because people kept saying, "Why weren't you promoted, Robert?" And I'm like, "I don't care. Not a big, it's not a big deal." But they noticed this. And the other thing that they noticed was he was now over all of us. And they needed to come to him with their questions. Now, because he didn't know as much as I knew at that point in time, people would bypass him and come to me. And I'm trying to be helpful, so I helped out my fellow coworkers, like who wouldn't? So I get called back into my boss's office again, and I'm like, God, what is happening now? So now this time, apparently, I am undermining his authority by helping other people. Okay, it's not what I was doing. I was just helping people, so I won't help anyone. I will just send them to him. So that's what I did. I started sending everyone to him. So about 3 months later, I get called back into the boss's office again, and I'm told that I wasn't helping anyone out. They had to fend for themselves, and he was just overloaded now. You see how this back and forth creates a toxic culture within the actual audit department. Now, are we looking at things like this in other departments? Promotional patterns will tell you what the organization really values or who the organization really values. Because again, I wasn't promoted, but I was compensated. And to me, I was happy. But to other people, they didn't know how much I was making. So to them, it looked like an injustice. It looked like a wrong that was being done. So are you looking at promotional patterns when you do your audit engagements? Is that something that you even thought about and the impact that it has on the office? Because remember that study I told you about earlier, toxic environment impacts productivity in the workplace. And the study also said that, hey, that one bad person has a bigger impact than your rock stars that you have. So that tells us that the impact of negativity on the culture compounds, right? Okay. So the next thing is the oversight budgets. Here's what I mean by this. The budgets that are allocated to the oversight functions such as internal auditing, compliance, risk management. If people hire auditors, but then make sure that the budget is so bad you can't adequately staff the department, that could be a sign of a bad culture. That could be a sign that they don't really want you to do the job for real because, well, being assurance providers is really not top priority for them. But having the window dressing to make it look like it's important is what's important to them. Anybody ever experienced that? You've been in charge of an audit department and your budget was so small, you just could not do anything. So, those are the 8 culture components that we can attempt to embed into almost any area that we audit that gives us insight into culture because culture isn't soft, it's not fluffy. It leaves data trails everywhere if we, as auditors, are willing to look. Because if you think about it, the success or failure of an organization really is intertwined in the culture that it creates. A lot of times we run across companies that we think are too big to fail and all that good stuff. I call bull on that. Any company can fail. Any company can fail at any moment in time. And oftentimes it's not the product or service, it's the culture. You guys remember Blockbuster Video? Most people think that it failed because, well, nobody looks at VHS tapes anymore. But did you know that Netflix approached them and said, hey, buy us? And Blockbuster said no, because the culture didn't understand what was happening and where the world was going. And so because of that, we have no more Blockbuster. You see, Netflix could have been named Blockbuster if their culture had been one of creativity, one of innovation. So listen, what you see on the screen now, that audit guy, that is me. My name is Robert Berry. I am a trainer for auditors. I also do one-on-one coaching as well. And we do co-sourced and or outsourced internal auditing. Excuse me. If you need training for your entire group, come talk to me, especially if you have a group of, say, 7 or more. I've got a special package that gives you all 40 hours of training dispersed throughout the year in different formats, on demand, live, and workshops at a reasonable rate on top of that. So, you know where to find me on LinkedIn, YouTube, my website. Now, think about this. Controls can catch errors, right? We're good at looking at controls. Controls can catch errors, but culture catches everything else. Ignoring culture has real, measurable cost. Auditors typically miss culture because, well, we default to what's easy. Culture multiplies risk. It's never just background noise. You can audit culture if you look in the right places. Because if you think about this, once trust is gone, it's almost impossible to get back fully. It is almost impossible to get back fully. So these are the points that I'll leave you with. Once again, ignoring culture has real measurable cost. Auditors miss it because, well, we default to what's easy. Culture multiplies risk. It is never just background noise. You can audit culture. You can. If you need help, give me a call. We can help you with that, either through our training or through our co-sourcing services. Because once trust is gone in your organization, it is impossible to get back. I want to thank you for joining me for episode 77 of Audit Bites, Why Auditors Ignore Culture, and what we can do about it. If you need help from me, reach out. I'm always available. With that said, thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you for watching this episode of Audit Bites. If you receive value from this podcast, do us a favor. First, tell other auditors. Second, give us a 5-star review. And finally, talk to Robert about training your auditors. Our contact information is on our website, www.thatauditguy.com. It's also where you will find our course catalog, on-demand courses, a kick butt blog, other podcasts, Robert's best-selling books, and last but not least, audit merch. That's right, we have audit hats, shirts, mugs, and more. Thanks for watching and listening. See you next episode.